Okay, back to Hebrews. Again, Hebrews is written in 7 major sections with a closing, so sort of an eighth. The core of the letter is written in a chiasmus. Starts in one place, moves to the center point, comes back out. First part of the chiasmus introducing who Jesus is, that he is God and he is man, and that's interrupted in the middle with the first of several warnings. Then comes a section on his role, which is as high priest, and he's a faithful high priest, which points to God, but he's a compassionate high priest, which points to us. And again, in the middle, another warning to not fall back, not go back like the Israelites did. And then we move into the center section of the letter, the core work, the great work of Jesus, which is where we are now. We're at the very end of that section. And that section, instead of interrupting it as the previous two sections with a warning, he moves the warnings to the beginning and the end so that the center section focuses on the great work. And the great work is his entering into the temple not made by human hands and presenting his blood as a sacrifice for our sins, once for all. And again, that message is bracketed by two warnings, probably the most severe warnings in the New Testament, probably even the Bible. And we've been through those. We're at the very end of the second warning. And where we ended up last week, he was talking about how their past suffering they had gone through, and that they should look to that, how they had made it through that to get through their current difficulties. And we pick up in verse 35. So don't lose your confidence, since it holds a great reward for you. So the confidence comes from the previous verse. Confidence they had to get through their earlier sufferings. And you look back on what you've done in your life, the struggles you've gone through. Right? A lot of part of this is perspective, where we look back and we go, oh, look at what God did to us. Look what I had to go through. I had to struggle with this. On the other hand, you came through it. Do you praise God that you made it through it, or you just, that's over and move on? But God gets us through these things. And we should look to our past. When we're going through current struggles, if you're going through struggles right now, you should not focus on the struggle, but look to the past struggles that you've gotten through. The perspective that you've been able to get. And how God has brought you through them. And that should give you confidence. Don't lose your confidence. Confidence in what? Confidence in God. Since it holds a great reward for you. And we will receive rewards. All believers will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Or the Bema seat, where we will be given various crowns, metaphorically. I don't think we can comprehend what God will reward us with. Try to explain to a 3 or 4 year old the value of a college degree and what that does for them. It's impossible. They can't comprehend it. And in the same way, we can't comprehend what God's going to give us. So it's portrayed as something, at least they would have understood in the first century, of crowns. Verse 36. For you need endurance, so that after you have done God's will, you can receive what he has promised. So that confidence that we have in God will give us the endurance that we need. And think about that formula for a second. Confidence leads to endurance. Have you ever worked hard at something and it was just really tough, but you knew within you just had the sense that you could do it? Right? There's no temptation to give up then, or there's very little. It's or easy to overcome the temptation. You endure because you have the confidence. And that's what he's saying here. Look to God. Look to God as your confidence. Do you have faith in God? Which we'll be coming to in the next chapter. That will give you the confidence to go through what you're going through. So that after you have done God's will, you can receive what he has promised. And notice that this is a temporal sequence here. This isn't a causal sequence. This isn't because you've earned it. This isn't you need to endure so that you can earn. You need to endure so that after. The promises are already ours. But we need to endure to the point that we get them. Verse 37. For in a very little while the one who is coming will return. He will not delay. So, a very little while, a short period of time. And of course this immediately brings up, well, it's been 2,000 years. Has it been 2,000 years for them? To the people he's writing to, has it been 2,000 years? Where are they right now? They're with Jesus. So, whether it's his coming back to earth at the end times or whether it's us going to him, in the scheme of things, it's a very little time. And it's one of the strange things about suffering and persecution. It's, the good times, that clock goes real fast. And in suffering, it seems that clock goes real slow. But very few people get to the end of their lives and say, wow, that was a long time. That just took too long. And so again, perspective is everything. And our hope, our confidence is in God. And if that's where our confidence is, we can endure pretty much everything. You look at in Greek this week, we were going through some of the word for witness. And the word for witness is basically where we get our word martyr. And it comes from the Christian martyrs in the Roman period, where they were brought in and in the Colosseum were fed for the lions, or they were put under all sorts of persecution. And that was deemed martyr. That was deemed a witness. I believe the Holy Spirit would come upon them, because some of the accounts, the Roman crowds were very disappointed. They were hoping to see a bunch of people running around and screaming and being chased by lions or gladiators or whatever they were doing that particular week. Instead, they had a bunch of people who came in, got together, and prayed and sang. That just wasn't as much fun. But it impacted their hearts. And I believe the Holy Spirit came upon them because of their confidence in God. And if they can endure that, what can we endure? So for in a very little while, the one who is coming will return. He will not delay. This is from Habakkuk 2:3. And this is one of those places that we know that the author is using the Septuagint, the Greek translation, rather than the Masoretic text, the Hebrew. And the reason for that is because the Hebrew text is the one must await the appointed time for the destruction of the enemies. And when that was translated, it was generalized into waiting for the deliverer. So we can tell that they're using the Greek text from this. And we see that with a lot of passages where there's the application at the moment, but then there's a long-term, broader perspective. And as the application, it's the same way we do with the New Testament now. There's what happened to those particular people, but then there's what lessons can we learn and apply it to our life. And Paul, or the author of Hebrews, I believe here, is using Septuagint because it's basically focusing more on, because we're not waiting for the Chaldeans, right? It's now focusing on the coming of the deliverer. Verse 38, but my righteous one will live by faith. And here we moved out of the end of the exhortation, and as we've seen in so many places before, there's sort of a linking verse, a passage or two that links, sort of concludes where they've just come from, but then links to where they're going. And you can see that here in the transition. But my righteous one will live by faith, and if he turns back, my soul will take no pleasure in him. And you can see how this is coming right after again, this is from Habakkuk, and it's coming right off of the exhortation we've had, which is if we keep on sinning, there's no sacrifice. But it's also pointing to the next section, which is to live by faith. This is a verse that Paul actually uses a lot. He uses it in Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11, and Ephesians 2:8. There he's using it as we are saved by grace through faith. But here the context is slightly different. Here the context is this is being used more as those who are saved will live by faith. And you think about it, those are two sides of the same coin. You know, sort of like asking, do we live by faith? Right? Or is it by faith that we are saved? You know, does a coin have a heads or does it have a tails?
Yes.
Yes. It's both. We are saved by faith through grace, not of yourself, as a gift of God. But how do we live? By faith. Faith is central to everything we do, which makes this such a perfect transition verse. And if he turns back, my soul will take no pleasure in him. Notice there's only two options in this verse. We can live by faith and draw closer to God, or we can turn back. There's no concept of standing still. And if you think about your life, you think about the world we live in today, it's pretty hard to stand still. We're very busy. Time is a commodity. We're being pulled in all these different ways. And if we don't consciously make a decision to draw nearer to God, will we just stay where we are? No, we'll start drifting. We will start drifting wherever the culture pulls us. And before you know it, right, we'll be someplace we really don't want to be. And that's what's before us. Do we turn back or drift back? Or do we make the conscious effort to seek after God, to live by faith? Verse 39. Now we do not belong to those who have turned back and are destroyed, but to those who have faith and are saved. So Paul ends this, or the author ends this, on a note of confidence.
ISV said turn back.
What's that?
The ISV says turn back.
Yes.
And NIV says shrink back, which to me gives a whole turning back and shrinking back. Shrinking is retreat to me, and turning is making a conscious effort to. It's just different, you know, it's interesting, it's different.
And I'm not sure. I have to look up the Greek word there and find out. This would BDAG will come in.
Yeah.
But it's basically, do we move forward or do we go back? And Paul here is saying to the people, he's giving them, this isn't a condemnation letter. We're coming at the end of one of the strongest warnings in the Bible, and note how he ends it. He ends it on a note of encouragement. And we've seen this before. Even when he's putting out some fairly stiff warnings and fairly stiff condemnations even, calling them lazy. Right? But he ends it with an encouragement to go forward. And that's how we should always approach our failures, actually, I believe. Is when we realize that we have failed, the point isn't to sit there and condemn ourselves, but to realize, yep, ask forgiveness, and then move on. Make it a lesson learned. Yeah, that's really, I need to be careful about that in the future. And use that as a way to move forward. We actually learn, our brains are wired to learn from our mistakes. And social scientists have actually measured brain activity, and they find out, they've given people simple problems and deliberately tripping them up so they will make a mistake. And they find that when we make a mistake, when we realize we're wrong, we get a little jolt in our brain. We get like a little electric shock to turn us around and correct us. And so when we make mistakes, how many are going to live a sinless life for the rest of their life? No hands?
Today.
How many minutes? Yeah, we're all going to mess up. God knows we're going to mess up. Right? The question is, what do we do about it? What does Satan want us to do? Yeah. You going to say something?
No.
Oh. What does Satan want us to do? He wants us to wallow in our sin and be told how unworthy we are. God wants us to seek forgiveness and then take it as a lesson learned not to do that again. But those who have faith and are saved. And the term that's translated "save" here is actually the preserving of a soul. And it could be salvation, but it could also just be talking more generally about the rewards that we get, not necessarily salvation. But the concept is one of preserving, enduring to the end. And how do we endure? Through faith. Which takes us to part 5. Accessing the work. And the first part of accessing the work, we've gone through this great work of Jesus. He is God and man. He is a compassionate and faithful high priest. He has gone into the temple not built with human hands and offered his blood as a sacrifice. That's great. How do we do that? How do we get a hold of that? How do we access that work that he has done for us? And as we saw in the linking verse, he has tied that into faith. And so now as we move into chapter 11, verse 1, we start as the great faith chapter. It starts, now faith is the assurance of what we hope for will come about, and the certainty that what we cannot see exists. Now, Greek text here is fraught with difficulties in terms of translation. It starts off with the Greek word estin, which means it is. So it starts basically right off the top with is, which either is defining the, this is in other words a formal definition, or it's emphasizing the reality of faith. So the first couple of words, the words assurance is hypostasis, and this is a pretty difficult word to translate because it has a range of meaning. What scholars talk about it, linguists talk about it as what a range, a lexical domain. And the lexical domain of hypostasis is very large. You think about the word run has a lexical domain. It can mean either to run as in run a marathon, or it can mean to run as in to run to the store. Right? Both meanings are encapsulated within the lexical domain of run. Hypostasis, it can have an objective meaning, or it can have a subjective meaning. So an objective meaning, it can mean things like substance, essence, realization, or attestation. The subjective meaning of it can mean internally, things like assurance or guarantee or confidence. So depending on how you translated that, for example, if you've ever heard a pastor or somebody talking about faith and how faith is an actual substance, something you can grab a hold of, they're using the objective meaning of that word. So it's I would actually translate it, and you can't translate it this way, but I would give you the meaning as it's our beliefs made real. It's what we hope for and what we base our lives upon.
This is the NLT second edition. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen.
Yeah. Yeah, the confidence. Now they're using, in confidence, they're using the subjective meaning of the word. Yeah, so it can be confidence, it's the guarantee, or it can be essence, realization, or attestation. It's how we live out what we believe.
Elton, I sometimes use the analogy of driving in the fog, like we had to do this last couple of days ago.
Yeah.
And you still go trusting that the road's up ahead there. You don't
Yep.
stop and then you get slammed from the back by somebody if you do. But
Yeah.
you just keep going. That to me is, okay, I don't see it, but I know it's up there. I've been on this road before. I know it's there. And you just go. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Actually, it is. It is a good definition because it's our beliefs made real. It's our beliefs turned into action. And we'll expand on that in a little bit as we get through into the rest of the definition. But it's not just an intellectual belief. We sometimes use faith to mean, this is what I believe will happen, right? Or you run into somebody and they say, oh yeah, I believe in God, right? Faith is how that belief works itself out in their lives, if it does. So it's the assurance that what we hope for will come about, the certainty that what we cannot see exists. And again, this certainty also has an objective or subjective. Objectively, it can be a test, evidence, or proof. It's used in ancient papyrus in terms of a legal concept, a legal, guilty in the eyes of the court, so for example. Or subjectively, it could just be a conviction or, again, a certainty. So again, you have this back and forth between an objective and a subjective meaning. That what we cannot see exists. And we see things. Do we see Christ around us? Do we see God? No. We see the world. Then why do we believe in God? Why do we believe in Jesus? That's where our faith comes in. I would put it in terms of faith is the assurance, which is subjective, we have in our beliefs. that allows us to live them out, which is the objective part. I sometimes put this in terms of an engineer and a bridge. Right? You can see a bridge that goes across a major chasm. If you've ever driven on one of these bridges that, you know, you look down and you get a little nervous, right? Why do you cross? Because you actually have faith that it will not fall. Now, an engineer can sit there and do all the calculations, all the statics and dynamic stresses on the bridge, the tensile strengths of the material, all that sort of stuff. They can calculate it and say, oh yeah, it will easily support my weight. That's a belief. But if he doesn't step out onto the bridge because he's still concerned it's going to fall, there's no faith there. But if he steps out on the bridge and he actually walks across it, that's an act of faith. So I see faith, and we'll see this as we start going through the examples here. Faith is our faith put into practice. It is the beliefs that we have made real in how we live out our lives. Now, let me deal with a slightly tangential subject here, which is the concept of faith and evidence. Some people see faith and evidence as mutually exclusive. In fact, I was in a discussion with a Mormon once, and I gave him all the evidence on why the Book of Mormon cannot be an historical text. And the evidence is pretty darn clear. I mean, if you look at the Bible, we have over 5,600 manuscripts, ancient manuscripts of the Bible. We know where places like Jerusalem were, right? There's no question that certain events described in the Bible happened. There's no question that people like David existed. We have archaeological evidence of David, at least we do now. 10 years ago we didn't, but we do now have evidence that David actually existed. So, there's just no question. If you want to know where, we're reading about a place called Bethlehem. Do we know where Bethlehem is? Can we go find it on a map? Sure. We talk about the Romans. We know where the Romans were? Yeah. So there's all this evidence that the Bible, we don't even oftentimes think about that as evidence for the Bible. We just take it for granted. Of course the Romans existed. How can that be evidence for the Bible? But when you compare it to the Book of Mormon, not a single person, place, or event mentioned in the Book of Mormon can actually be tied to anything in history. And for example, when I was looking into the church back in the early 70s, and if you want to find out more about that, you can go on to consider.org, and I have my testimony there, and it talks about how the Mormons were an important part of my coming to Jesus, even though they didn't think they were. But, I was one of those strange people. I was actually led to Christ by Mormon missionaries. Because, probably need to explain that, don't I?
Yes. Otherwise you may stand up and walk out.
I was on a TV show, and I was giving my testimony, and when I got to the conclusion, which I'll tell you what the conclusion is in a minute. What happened was I was investigating the church. We'd been investigating for a while, and the Mormon missionaries finally, I think they got pressure from on high to get us to make a decision. So they encouraged me to do 3 days of prayer and fasting. I'm giving a real brief version here. And after 3 days of prayer and fasting, I failed the first time. Second time, they encouraged me to try again, so I did. And towards the end of the third day, and by the way, if you ever pray for 3 days of prayer and fasting, God will not answer you on the first day or the second day. He will wait till the end of the third day to give you your answers. You just got to gear yourself for that. Right? So at the end of the third day, I was praying and going through the Bible, and I came to Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace you are saved through faith, not of yourself, is a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. And the best way I can describe it is it's like you're sitting in a dark room, and your eyes have adjusted, and you think you know where everything is. Someone comes and turns on the light and you realize nothing was what you thought it was. At that moment, the Holy Spirit came into my life, turned on the light, and I could suddenly see everything around me. For the first time in my life, that verse made sense. I look back now, after 30 years, and I can't really conceive of how I could have read it any other way. To me, the verse is just so darn clear. But that's the spiritual blindness that Paul talks about. And so, at that same time, and it was all in a split second, at the same time I knew that Joseph Smith wasn't a prophet, the Book of Mormon wasn't good. That verse undercut everything that they believe. And so when the Mormon missionaries came back, and being the type of person I am, I literally did say, well, I have some good news and I have some bad news. The good news is I got an answer to prayer. Bad news is it wasn't the one you wanted. And we had a 3-hour-long discussion starting on that verse. And, a Christian for a couple of days, starting on that verse and going through the Bible and the plan of salvation and basically coming back around to that verse at the very end. And after 3 hours of working our way through the Bible, we came back to that verse. And the Mormon missionary said, yeah, that's exactly what we believe, that we were saved by faith. And I picked up one of the books they had loaned me, and I wish I had that book now because I'd like to find the quote again. But I picked up one of the books. I think it was from Joseph Fielding Smith, one of their later prophets, and he said the doctrine of salvation by grace through faith is out of the pit of hell. And the Mormon missionary got really quiet, and basically that was the end of the discussion. And he was transferred later that week, which Mormon missionaries get transferred one of two reasons. Get transferred for moral indiscretion, or they get transferred for a struggle of faith. So that's the, I did that story, and they asked me my testimony on TV as a Christian show, and I did that story, but I didn't do quite the same setup. I just went through my salvation story. So I was talking about the Mormon missionaries, and I'm talking about, and I finally got to the end where, I rejected Mormonism and accepted the God of the Bible. Han was sitting in the audience with one of the next guests to come up, and was a pastor. And when I said that, that I thought that Joseph Smith was not a prophet, he went, I think I had a few people nervous. So, when I was talking to this Mormon about the fact that there isn't a single bit of evidence for the Book of Mormon, and by the way, when I was going through that, the point I was making is that they had told me at that point that the prophecy in the Book of Mormon that the faith would spread from the North Sea to the tip of the South Sea, from the very east to the very west. And that meant that there'd be people all the way up to top of North America, the Eskimos. There'd be a tribe at the very tip of South America, which was, they gave me the name of the tribe, and of course, east to west across the entire continent. Well, since that time, archaeology and research has done a lot more, and they found out that, for example, based on blood types, that none of the American Indians could be Semitic. They could not have come from Jerusalem, which is where the Book of Mormon people supposedly came from. And over time, that has just been condensed down, condensed down, condensed down, condensed down, just to where they could be. And they were holding out hope for the Mayans, because they hadn't been able to read the Mayan language. But if only they could break and read the Mayan language, they would see all this Book of Mormon stuff in there. Right? Well, about 1999, 2000 time frame, they cracked Mayan language. You can probably guess what was not in there. So now last I heard, they're struggling to try and find someplace on the Yucatan Peninsula, because the Yucatan Peninsula kind of comes down and goes up a bit and comes back down. So you can kind of get a north and a south and east and a west. But even that doesn't work out for them. And there's actually some Mormons who are now arguing that, well, this is all just, it's mythical. It's allegory to teach us something. It's not historical. That's still a very minority position within the Mormon Church. But when I was talking to him about this complete, utter, total lack of evidence, in fact, there's also evidence to the contrary, his reaction was, great, that just means my faith is even stronger. Right? So we sometimes fall into the same position. When we look at what's going on in the world around us, I'm going to ignore the evidence. I'm going to go by faith. And so I want to talk a little bit about faith and evidence, because I don't think that's a biblical position. when we're talking about faith here, this is a big faith chapter, it does not exclude evidence. It's not the fact that this is what I believe, even though the evidence goes against it. That can be faith, but we would normally call that blind faith. This is, I'm going to act on my beliefs, regardless of what the basis is for it. It's not saying everyone has to go out and become an apologist and know all the evidence and act only on the evidence. It's not saying that either. The key part of faith is that we are acting on what we believe, that we're living out what we believe. And we can have evidence for that or no evidence for that. But I would argue if we don't have evidence, then how do we know we're not in the same position as the Mormon? Where, we're right and they're wrong, but we don't really have any idea why. To me, I have big trouble with that. This is sort of like salvation is a big roulette wheel with all the various religions in the world, and you spin the wheel and see what number yours comes out on. Okay, that's the one I'm going to pick, and hoping that it's the right one. I don't think God has put us in that position. In fact, I know God hasn't put us in that position.
This doesn't talk about Jesus, but it's in Romans 2 it talks about that since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power. This is Romans 2:19-20. His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, but that everyone is without excuse.
They're without excuse.
And there's more to that, but.
And as an apologist,
Right.
I really believe that verse
Right. I mean,
because I've seen the evidence out there. You also see this in John 10. Remember when Jesus is brought before the Pharisees. This is by the way, in terms of the outline of John 10. John 10 builds through a series of events in the first half of the book. The climactic part of the first half of the book is the confrontation in the temple where the Jews say, basically, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here a bit, they say, enough already. Tell us who you really are. And Jesus says, I and my Father are one. At which point they go to stone him. And he asks them, why are you stoning me? Because you, being a mere man, claim to be God. And then Jesus goes into an explanation of his claim. And if you look at verse 37 and verse 38 there, he says, if I don't, and again I'm slightly paraphrasing here, but not too much, if I don't have the evidence to back this up, don't believe me. But if I do what my Father has commanded, i.e. if I've done the miracles that I've said I've done, if I've provided you the evidence that I've provided you, then believe the evidence. So I don't believe evidence is against what we should have. In fact, Paul says in Thessalonians, test everything. Hold on to the good. We are to test. We are to examine our faith. And we are to get rid of those parts that aren't true. John says, John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes into the Father but by me. Why did he pick truth there? Why didn't he pick something else? Think of all the adjectives.
I don't know for sure, but Jesus described God to Nicodemus as spirit and truth.
Yeah. Truth is something, particularly in the epistles of John, truth appears every couple of lines. There's this concept of truth that is very important to who God is. And notice it does say, I am the way, the love, and the life. We like to take love and make it up there as number one, because God is truth. Because it is truth. And living a life of truth is a really difficult life to live. Especially considering how much we are not truthful even to ourselves. We've talked a little bit about that before. So, it's not a question of faith versus evidence. it's more faith plus evidence. But even if you have lots of evidence, evidence will not save you. Right? There are lots of people out there who believe that God exists. They may even claim to be Christians. But do they see that? Do you see that in their lives? Are they living that out in the way they live their lives and in what they do? An even scarier question is, when people think of you, is that how they think of you? Yeah, he's a Christian. Or she's a Christian. Because they can see that in the way you live your life. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to walk around and say, yeah, I go to church every Sunday. Right? They just sort of know it.
Sort of when they're hungry and they know they can reach out and pick fruit.
Yeah. And actually, when you go through 1 Peter. 1 Peter says, always be prepared to give an answer to those who ask for the reason for the hope that you have. When you put that in context, that's not saying go out and be, an apologist and make sure you can answer every Bible difficulty and that you can do everything, That's not really written for me. It's written more for the average Christian. It's written for you. And it's basically, when you put the whole verse in context, it says live your life in a way that's a testimony. So that when people have problems, they will come to you and, how do you do it? Is basically what they're going to ask you. How do you get through life? Why are you always so happy? Why do you always seem so calm? Why do you just seem to have something about you that I don't have? At which point you give them the reason or the hope that you have. It doesn't require you to be a master in biblical languages or to know archaeology or to know Bible difficulties or know all about creation and evolution or anything of those things. It's why are you a Christian? What do you have that's missing in my life, and why should I want it in mine? Yeah.
It's often most evident in the hardest of times, the times we'd rather not go through, but in those times, if we are living, and that's when people ask, I don't know how you did it. I don't know how you got through that, the way you did.
Yeah. And sometimes those are unanswerable. I look at some of the things that have happened in my life, and you know what? I could come up to me and ask me, how did I get through that? Now, part of that's because I'm a male, and there's actually a lot of studies that show that when males go through difficulties, their brains actually release chemicals that deaden the memory, and we don't remember it. And they also cause euphoria. So if you ever get in an argument with your spouse, right? The guys are, and this is not me, this is actual studies and biochemistry and stuff. What'll happen is after the argument breaks up, the guy's going to go away. His brain's going to start pumping his brain full of chemicals that are going to cause him to forget what they've just gone through and feel good about himself. So he's going to go off. He's going to go, wow, we got that out. That's settled. Good clearing of the air there. What's on TV? Meanwhile, the woman, their brains actually inject chemicals that cause them to, relive that and go over it and over it, and to cement that into their memory. Which is why if you've ever had a confrontation and then an hour or a day later you suddenly come back and one of them's completely forgot about it and the other one is like, this is still live and fresh and raw.
Okay, Elgin, I have a question for you. I don't think you're going to be able to answer it. So this is chemicals you're talking about.
It actually is biochemical.
Okay, here's my question. Why do you think God did that?
Why did God make men and women different?
Yeah.
I think because we have, we're different, but we're complementary. And I don't think, and this is partially biblical, but it's partially me, and you can pray to the Holy Spirit about how to separate out which is which. But I think God made man and woman as complementary parts that each by themselves is not complete. But when you put them together, and you put them together in harmony, they literally become greater than the sum of their parts. And that the two do become one. Hannah and I are coming up on our 40th wedding anniversary. And it's literally inconceivable to me not to be married to her. And not to, it's just, I literally cannot conceive of it. It would be like ripping a part of me away from me. And when I'm in Oshkosh or Appleton during the week, it's painful at times because I just want to be back with her. And I think that's what God has intended. And that has been graciously distorted over the years. We have, as human beings, we have a very, very difficult concept with different, because we tend to think different as like this instead of like this. And so it's part of the political correctness today. That's why I threw in all those words about biochemistry, because it's not me. Because people hear men and women are different, and they suddenly hear men and women are unequal, right? And we had a conversation with some friends of ours, and I could sense that, because I was defending the traditional view that men and women are different, and I could sense a little hostility building on the other side. And so I immediately had to step back and say, I keep my wife barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen because she only has 2 master's degrees, one in nursing and one in computer science. So it's like I really keep her repressed, right? So to me it's not a non-issue. I mean, I'm incomplete without her. She's incomplete, I hope, without me. And together, that's what the marriage is all about, is becoming something greater and more than just the individual parts. And I think that is by design, because you know what? There's things I'm better at than she is, and there's things she's clearly better at than I am. And part of it is training, but part of it is different temperament. And I think that goes into the whole issue of why marriage is important, and the whole marriage debate in our country at the moment, because it's not it's not opposition to homosexual marriage. It's really pro-traditional marriage. It's a statement of why this is so important, which I believe is actually from history. In the 1800s, that's why we started passing marriage laws, because of the disruptions of society. Children were being hurt and damaged, and society responded by trying to institutionalize marriage into a public governmental function to strengthen it so that it would maintain the bounds. Before that, it was held by the church and the community, but as community and church began to weaken, government came in. Well, now we see since the 70s, we see a weakening of the family, and that's, to me, is only expanding. Yeah.
The chemistry thing is, but I think there are other factors. My first real awareness of my stepfather was seeing him strap my Down syndrome brother, and for years he was very severe, and by the grace of God, over time, God put a variety of surrogate dads in my life that allowed me to see that that's not the only way that a male is.
No. And I agree. And to me, I have a little principle I live by. It's not really biblical. It's not unbiblical, I don't think. But it's just sort of a little guideline I go by. And one is there's pros and cons to everything. But the other big one is that the propensity for good is equaled by propensity for bad. Think about what you can get out of a loving relationship, right? What I get with my relationship with Hannah, right? That's just, to me, a tremendous good, indescribable. But when you get into a relationship like that, there are risks. And what if it goes bad? It can get really bad, can it? The propensity for good is outweighed by the propensity for bad. So when you have a biblical principle like family and fatherhood, right, it can be a tremendous benefit and good in a person's life. But if it's misused and abused, it can be a tremendous source of harm. Which is why I think we all need to be careful as we live our lives that we are living as God would intend us to live. Because we do have effects on other people. And we are kind of over time here a bit. So let me go ahead and close in a word of prayer.